benefit.
Okay, so tonight, first topic is managing devices using AAA, authentication, authorization, and accounting. And what we're going to talk about are two of the AAA servers here. We've got TacacsRadius, which is Cisco proprietary, and Radius, which is an open source. And what happens here, if we're trying to go into a device, there are a couple of ways that we've talked about, actually, a couple of ways we've talked about. Yeah, like the enable password where everybody has the same password, and then we can make a local database. This is a third way to where we can use an authentication server and have usernames and passwords on it. And if you're in an Active Directory environment, you can actually send the Radius request to Active Directory to use these things. So what happens is we try to get in telnet console, whatever else, console cable to a device. The device then sends the request to the authentication server. And when you try to get in Cisco, it's going to ask you for your username and password. And that gets sent to the AAA server, the authentication server, be it Tacacs or Radius, which then gives a response, a yay or a nay, a check, an up or a down, and a couple of little response from the server, the network device login. The Cisco, and this is ACS, is Access Control Server. Authentication server, Radius and Tacacs. Radius is an open standard, uses UDP, uses authentication, authorization. Tacacs, Cisco proprietary. It does authentication, authorization, and accounting. And notice over here, Radius doesn't do accounting. Radius can do a kind of a basic form of accounting, but not to the extent of the Tacacs server. So the device management, authentication, authorization, and accounting, it's in red because you'll probably see that again. Framework provides security services to manage user access to the network devices. Three major types of service: authentication, authorization, accounting. We've kind of talked about these before, I think. Security information, the AAA server maintains the security information in its own database for the devices. And the network devices, we can either use Tacacs or Radius protocols. Both are supported. So authentication is when we prove who we are. Authorization is what we can do. And accounting is what we did, basically, in one word. It identifies the users, validating usernames and passwords, or whatever else is there. It supports a challenge and response mechanism, and we'll look at challenge and response when we talk about PAP, and I think that actually is on the on lesson 10. What it essentially is we send a request to get in to the server. It sends back a challenge, a random string of characters. We encrypt that random string with our password and send a hash back, and then it does it hashes using the same hashing algorithm, compares it to the password that's stored there. And it uses a methods list. We'll look at that. I want to do a Radius demo, and I'll probably do it before you guys do the lab right after we talk about Tacacs. Because the process is very similar as to what these things do. To define authentication type. What the methods list says that we're going to do, and I will demonstrate it, that first we may use the Radius server. If the Radius server isn't available, then we'll use the local database. If the local database isn't available, and who knows why that wouldn't be, then we'll use the enable password. So first it tries Radius. If it's available and you don't know your username and password and you get timed out, it doesn't go to local. If Radius server is down, we don't have connectivity, then it will go to the local database that we've created on the local device. Authorization checks sets of attributes to authorize the actions that we can perform, what we can do. Uses a local database or attribute value pairs to validate user permissions. and supports authorization per service, per user account or profile, and one-time authorization. What that means per service, what can we do? We can set users up so that they can only perform certain commands in the devices themselves. And then accounting is what we did, collects the information, reports the activity. It is not available in local, so local has no accounting capability. Using the local database, and we'll give that one a shot too before we do the other one. AAA service can provide locally on a switch. I think we've already done that without using a server and switch or router. Either one is implemented in local mode by using a local database. Local database stores the profile that's used for authentication and authorization locally on the machine. Local mode only authorization services are available. Accounting features are not available. And we enable, and we talk about local here. So if we have a local database enabled and now we want to use AAA, when we do that, we go away from using the local database to using the AAA server. And when we use the AAA server, the first command that we need to do is AAA new model. And then authentication login default local command will, okay, then this will get the local database. You don't really have to do all of this to use a local database. What we could do here, default local, we could put in this list, in this methods list, we could put the radius group, and then it would use it first and on down the line. Say AAA authorization exec local to authorize the privilege exec mode access. Enter the AAA authorization exec local to authorize access to network related services, authorization network local, different things that we can do with the authorizations here if we want to. Specify username, login information stored in the local database, entering the username, privilege, password, type. And we'll do that. We'll create a couple of local users, and then we'll go to the AAA server. So on these TACACS terminal access control access system name, what they call it, TACACS, Cisco proprietary centralized authentication of remote access devices through AAA, requires a TACACS server, a TACACS daemon running on the server, supports the database, stores the service. Single user enables use of single access control server for the separate databases. It uses TCP and uses port 49 and does support multi-factor authentication, which means that we can use smart cards or key fobs or the other things that are available. And here we get the authentication request. And the authentication request comes from the device. So we're trying to get into it. It's connected, sends the authentication request, and then we always say authentication accepted. It could send a deny back also if you have typed in the wrong credentials. The operations of this thing authenticates the user through the interactive dialog. It asks for your username and then your password when you put that in. Prompted to enter the login information, username and password. TACACS finishes the authentication, sends a response to the device. We can accept. If it's successful, reject, fail due to incorrect information. An error has failed due to an error such as a network connection issue. The device uses the alternate methods to authenticate the user. If we have, and the alternates would be the methods list, what's called a methods list. When we do those things, continue. User authentication continues, and the user is challenged for more information, such as mother's maiden name, the things that you get on websites today. If you hadn't been there for a while, or if you haven't said, okay, trust this computer so it can set a cookie for you. If it's successful, the settings are enabled on the device, and the daemon validates the user's permission, sends the accept or reject response. attributes that authorize access to services in the accept response itself when we do that. So, I mean, I don't think there's anything magic in any of these slides tonight. So the TACACS login authentication uses a methods list to define the authentication sequence of authentication step. And I think that probably we keep saying methods list and those things. Let me, and again, the process is very similar. Let's do some of this right now. This one doesn't have anything on it. And what I wanted to do was to, because I always just click on them, we have to connect a rollover cable to the console port when we actually connect to these things, and then go through the terminal. 9600, 8 data bits, no parity, 1 stop bit, and no flow control. When I get to the device, the console, we're there. I don't have to do anything. So let's try a config T, and let's try a username Mary, and then after this we'll say password, and we'll say password. And then what that said, we do config T, and then the slide said that we would do AAA new model, and then we would log in. I think it's log in. Yeah, log in. Authentication. Now let's say log in on failure. Now it's not a login, it's authentication, right? How about AAA? Authentication. And then what are we going to do? Let's do log in, and then we can do the word, the name for the authentication, or the default. And then we have the list of things that we can use. So we created a local database. Let's try local, and then let's see if I have messed it up. Username Mary, and then the password was password, and so we're in, and we can do those things. If I wanted to do a radius server here, we do a little bit more. First of all, we have to have a radius server, and that's what this guy is here, and this has got the steps over here. So in it we have AAA, and I have it set up for radius. Router 0 and router 1, the addresses here are going to be, and we have to define a key. We have this really clever key here, secret. And then I have a username with a really complex password of my pass. So what we'll go ahead and do is go ahead and do the configuration, a similar process for TACACS. The first thing we have to do is tell it where the radius server is, 192.168.1.2, and then the authorization port. And you shouldn't have to do this if you use the standard port. The next thing with the question mark we do is the key, and we had the key, that shared key there was secret, so now we have defined it. We've already done the AAA new model, so I should be able to go in here and do a AAA authentication, log in, default, and right now I'm going to change this, and we'll do group radius. And then we can add others. Now we can do our local And this is the methods list. And after the methods list, if that doesn't work, then we could do enable, or we could do none. If everything else failed, we can put none in there so that, yeah, we can still get in and take care of our devices. We could go in and well, actually, let's try something here. And let's disable, and let's log out, and let's try this user. This takes a little while because it apparently has to wake up the server to make it work. Okay, so I'm in it. It allowed me in. Show run here. So we're in with it. Now, let's see, line VTY04. You notice they don't have anything, so we could go in here, and if we wanted to use this for telnet, line VTY04, and we would do login, authentication, default, because when we specified default with in the AAA authentication default, we did that. We could have made it a different word. We could have used a word instead of default there. I'm gonna do both of them, line VTY 55515, and we'll do login, authentication, default on these things. And we can disable, we can get out of this thing. Log out. And now let us figure out what its IP address is, 1.3, and let's see if we can telnet to it. Telnet to 192.168.1.3. Username, and this should be using the Radius server, and that was the user that was on the Radius server. So I said, and in telnet I can't get into the enable mode because the enable password, the enable secret hasn't been set, no password set, so we can't get there. But those are basically the steps to configure this thing, and hopefully you saw, yeah, we have a methods list. The methods list is the authentication method that we're going to use, the group radius or group TACACS, whichever one, local, none, enable, whatever we need to do with those. So specify the host running the TACACS server, we did that, or the let's say the AAA server. Enable AAA by entering AAA new model. Define the authentication methods list, AAA authentication, login, default, list name. If we had called it something else, we could have named it here. Actually, we could have named it earlier, and then AAA login, authentication, default, list name command. We can have multiples of those available. Local database, local keyword is used. For TACACS, use the AAA authorization TACACS network local command for authorizing access to the network related services, and this is an authorization, and authorization for them we use the TACACS keyword in one and the Radius keyword in the other one, and then network to allow access to network services, and exec for authorizing access to the privileged exec mode. We could have done that in ours, but I wasn't clever enough. Uses the authorization mechanism supported by AAA to restrict to privilege exec mode and network services on the device. TACACS supports sophisticated authorization capabilities that specify the actions a user can perform in a session, used to control the facilities available to the user by specifying limits on the access services. And down here, authorization process checks the profile information stored in the local database or the TACACS Plus server, depending on the permissions provided by the user's profile, authorizes or denies access. And then the TACACS configuration steps, configure authorization settings, AAA authorization, the same basic steps: authentication, authorization, what are we going to use, and the methods list, what order are we going to use these things in when we do that. TACACS accounting, it is tracks the services and resources that we use, uses accounting records to manage information. It has what they call attribute value pairs, and it enables the accounting to track a user's access to the network services. This might be able to be used for billing, for instance, if you were charging different departments by their network usage, because IT networkers don't really contribute anything to the bottom line. Make it more efficient, make it better, but you can't go in and say, we make this product and we make so many millions of dollars by selling this product. So what this accounting allows you to do is find out which departments, which users are using the services provided, and then you build a department. That's just one of the ways that it might be. Configured to track privilege exec mode, and this would then, we would know who was in the system at what time also. Start record notice when the user enters privilege exec mode, and a stop notice when the user finishes that mode. So some commands here: AAA authentication, default enables the AAA authentication to validate users' access in privilege mode. These are some of the ones that you're going to be using in the labs, and then there are let's go ahead and continue and talk about TACACS. The process basically the same as it is with TACACS. Talk about Radius. It's basically the same. Remote authentication dial-in user service. It's something that's been used for a long time, and it really did start as a dial-in authentication mechanism. Maybe something like back during the dial-up days of the internet, if you remember that, where you had to put in your username and password and call in. And if you were at a different city, I was a Prodigy user, and if I was in a different city, I could call in, put in my username and password, and get authenticated to the database and use the service in a different location. And some of them had 800 numbers, lots of different things. It uses UDP, whereas TACACS used TCP, and it uses port 1812 and 1813 as the transport protocol. They said a remote access server in a network can be configured as a Radius server, and all the other devices that access the server can be configured as Radius clients. Okay, so we set up a Radius server. Radius is open source. If you're using Microsoft, it's built into the Microsoft servers. So we have this thing that we can use then to authenticate. We can build a username and password database, or again, if you're in a Microsoft environment, you can use Active Directory database in order to do Radius authentication. Radius clients pass the authentication request to the Radius server, just like TACACS did. Routers and switches can be configured as Radius clients, which you saw me do in the demo earlier, and use configuration remote access policies. And logging are centralized. User configuration remote access and usage logging are centralized. So it does have a degree of logging, a degree of accounting available in it. Again, here it's the same basic process. We send our packet type and access request, username and password, goes to the Radius server. Access, accept, or reject the user service frame protocol. And then access challenge, this is optional, challenge reply message. So challenge is when, again, we send a character stream, we encrypt it with our password, send it back, and then it checks the hash to be sure that we're who we say we are. To prompts for the username and password, you saw that in the demo. Server, once it finishes authentication, it sends a response to the device, can be an accept, reject, which we had before. A challenge here, user authentication continues and the user is challenged to enter more information. And then a challenge password could be sent. The user is prompted to enter a new password in this one. If it's successful, authorization settings are enabled on the device and validates the user's permission, sends the accept or deny. Again, basically the same process that we saw in TACACS. Some of the services are authorized to access SSH, Telnet, R login, privilege exec services, same process with the authentication commands that we saw because they're all part of the AAA new model set of commands that are available. The Radius server, a host that's using a Radius server is configured with several components in the form of command parameters. A Radius server can use different ports. We can specify the port, and you saw when I did the demo, I specified the port that was going to be used that was on the Radius server itself. A client uses a unique identifier, a combination of a host name or IP address, UDP port, number to access the required service for the Radius service. The reason we have a group, and I think it probably will show up here in a minute, is that we can have multiple Radius or TACACS servers, and they would all share a common database for authentication. We get some load balancing that way so that one of them doesn't get overused. And I don't know that from experience in networks that in Active Directory, oh yeah, we need a really big server. Well, all an authentication server's got to do is check the database, say yes or no. It doesn't have to do a whole lot of processing. But the component, host name and address, the host name and IP address, which acts as the Radius server, authentication destination port, the UDP port that handles the request, the accounting destination port, and we can have different ports for each of these that handles the accounting portion, the timeout period, number of seconds the device waits for a response from the Radius server, and you saw in my demo that it had to wait a little bit, and after the initial one, it gets a little bit better. One of the things that happens is we've still got to do the ARP to find the MAC address in order to send it there. Retransmission value, the number of times the client can resend the request to the Radius server, and then the key string was the secret key, acts as the encryption key to secure communications. It also acts as a password, as a key to know that we've configured them properly and that they should be talking to each other, one logging into the other on those. Radius login authentication uses a methods list just like TACACS did. Configuration of Radius can also include specification of other security protocols, act as backup if Radius fails. So we had the group Radius, and then I used local. We didn't shut it down to see if it works. Again, Packet Tracer has some limitations in the simulations that it does. And then we could have done after that, we could have done enable and then maybe none if we wanted to. If Radius fails, and if the Radius fails, then it'll use the local database. If the local database for some reason failed, then it would use the enable password, or we could put enable over here, whatever you wanted to do. But the methods list gives us some resiliency, I guess, so that if we lose communication, server goes down, gets restarted for whatever reason, then we don't lose access to our resources. If it fails, the radius denies user access same way as TACACS, then you're denied. It doesn't go to the second method. The methods are only available when the first service isn't available. And to configure it, radius server host, and we gave that, we had to identify where it is, AAA new model, and then authentication, AAA authentication login, default, or a list name. We can do either here. We can use default, or we can name it method 1, method 2, on down the line, group radius, local, and I think the correct number is 4 methods that we can have in here. Enable login by entering the login authentication default list. The default keyword specifies the default method list applied on the interfaces. The list name specifies one particular method list from the methods list that's configured in the AAA authentication login command. And again, hopefully saw that in the little demo. Server groups. Groups of servers can be used. Groups of AAA servers can be used to provide the AAA services, and we have to have them all the same, either Radius or TACACS. Subset of the server group can be dedicated to handle one type of service. The IP address of the server hosts in a server group are maintained in a global host list, and then one server host can be defined using multiple host entries. This all goes around, so we can have multiple servers. Each has a unique identifier, combination of IP address or host name and the UDP port number. Unique identifier determines the port that offers one particular service, and the particular service we talk about authentication and authorization. Authentication and authorization, I guess, and then where we're going to have these things. And down here the command AAA group server radius, and then the group name. And down here server IP address, the command to associate the radius server host with a AAA server group. We define the group, and then the server and the IP address gets associated with those server groups, so that we can have more than one radius server if you have multiple radius servers in use. I think basically the same thing here, uses the same authorization mechanism as TACACS. A user authorized to access services based on the profile. Authorization process follows same steps as TACACS. And again, they're doing the same thing. One's open source, one's proprietary. TACACS does give you better control for the authorization component. Configure the authorization section, AAA authentication authorization network radius command. Same thing, AAA authentication exec authorization radius, whatever we're going to do. Access the you can restrict access by entering the radius global configuration command. Network, we had the network command and the exec command, same as we had in TACACS. Accounting, track services and resources used by the users. It's configured to send user activity information to the radius server. You can, we'll go with that. Radius server, you can, there is actually some configuration that you can do. So the accounting is going to be on the radius server itself. Uses accounting records to manage information related to the user activity. And same steps, AAA accounting network, start, stop, radius, AAA accounting exec network, and it gives us the start and the stop times of the user's session. Again, basically the same as we had in TACACS. Load balancing, distribution of services across multiple servers, reduce CPU loads. Again, if you have that issue, that would be, to me, a really large network. an Active Directory. Windows had an Active Directory. How many Active Directory servers do you need tool? I did it one time for us, and we had like 400 or 500 users, and it came up to like a half of because you can't do that, a half of an Active Directory server. So how much do you actually need? May have CPU loads. If that's the case, multiple servers, and do the load balancing with this thing. It's received for the first time. The request is considered as a new transaction requesting a new batch. And what this thing does is create batches of authorization requests and then sends them to the server. The batch sizes are specified during the configuration. The server queue, the one that has the least number of transactions, is selected. One batch of transactions is in the selected server queue. So same thing that you would expect in a load balancing. It's not a strict round robin that goes from one to the other. It's a weighted round robin, so that kind of weighted. It checks to see which one's busy, and then it sends the request to the unbusy one. This is a little summary slide about what we have in these things. The features, the port numbers, TacacsRadius Radius 1645 and 1812 are the radius numbers. 1812 and 1813 was the one earlier. That's for authentication and authorization. 1645 was the one that I used in the demo. Those are the standard ports that we use. Encrypt the passwords, yes for both. Encrypts the entire packet, yes for Tacacs and no for Radius. So you can centralize which users can issue commands on devices in your network. Only certain users may be able to reload the router. So we can use those things. And then this is the summary. I told you this one wasn't very long tonight. AAA framework provides security to manage user access to network resources, and we use the AAA new model command in order to get into this. We could use the local authentication, local database that we create on the device itself, or we can use a centralized authentication and authorization server. We can do authorization in the local database too. AAA server security information provides services through Tacacs and Tacacs Plus and the Radius protocols. Tacacs Plus, Cisco proprietary. The authentication, accept, reject, error, and continue. The Radius protocol enables the server to provide standardized and centralized authentication for remote clients. It's an open source thing. I keep saying it's on Microsoft. It is on Microsoft servers. You can get a Radius server and install it on a device, install it on a Linux machine. A number of open Radius servers are available. It had the accept, reject, challenge, and challenge password responses that were available. When we define them, we use a methods list. Start out with a group radius, local, enable, none, maybe. That if we get down to the enable passwords not working, we may want to say, okay, well, let's just let these guys in, or let me in, so that we can do things. Tacacs and Radius use authorization mechanisms to restrict user access to privileged exec and to the network services. Are there questions?